Hi, everyone. Thank you for joining us for today's KPA webinar. Want to let you know you're in the right place as you're filing in. Going to wait about another minute before we get things started. Hello again to everyone filing in. Want to let you know that if you're here for the KPA webinar, you're in the right place. Just going to get things going in about another 30 seconds as we let some other people get in the room. We thank you for joining us. Hi, everyone, and welcome to today's Safety and Health webcast, 5 Steps to a Successful Safety Program, sponsored by KPA. My name is Kevin Drewley. I'm an associate editor with Safety and Health magazine and will be moderating today's session. Thanks for joining us. We hope you all are safe and well. In a few minutes, we'll start our pre-recorded presentation, but first, let's review some preliminary items. The views of today's speakers and organizations are their own and do not necessarily reflect those of the National Safety Council or Safety and Health magazine. Any mention of a commercial enterprise, product, or publication does not mean the council or magazine endorses those items. Although today's webcast is pre-recorded, we still encourage you to ask questions that will be forwarded along to today's speaker. To ask a question, simply click the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen, type your question, and click the send button. Feel free to ask your question at any time during the presentation. At the end of the webcast, you will be asked to complete a brief evaluation survey. I will let you know more about that after the presentation. This webcast is archived, so you can access it after today's live event. To view this webcast and all of our past webcasts, go to safetyandhealthmagazine.com/events. With that, let's go ahead and get started. Our speaker today is Amanda Rawls. Amanda serves as district manager at KPA, specializing in regulatory and compliance procedures. She has more than 16 years experience as an environmental and safety consultant and has conducted more than 1,600 on-site audits and written more than 20 spill prevention, control, and countermeasure plans for various industries. We thank Amanda for her insights and expertise. One final reminder before we begin the presentation today to please adjust the volume on your computer if the sound level seems low. We thank you again, and please stand by.
So I know that we were looking forward as the year was winding down. We're going to do all these things to get our agenda together. We're really going to make a difference, but December is just the end of the quarter, the end of the year. We've got the holidays coming up. So maybe all the right thoughts were in place, but we haven't actually done that. And so I just thought this would be a helpful time for us to discuss some of these agenda points. So we'll have a couple of steps to success. So for some of our programs, they've maybe matured and they're already moving in a more successful direction. For those of us that don't really know where to start, we are going to need some tips on how to do that. For regulatory requirements, really, as we're working through safety and environmental compliance, we need to have a skeleton outline of the goals that we're working towards. And some of those are just the regulatory deadlines that exist. So I'll also help you to identify what some of those deadlines are and what's the best way, scheduling wise, to make sure that we are working towards those. And then, of course, another way to kind of estimate how good of a job we did and what we can really target our time for in the future is just looking at historical accidents that have happened on site. It's a great way to pivot your program. If you're looking for some smaller projects, perhaps, this is really going to give you some insight into how to do that. And then at the end, I just have a couple more little tips for us that maybe didn't fit in elsewhere, but nonetheless, they're going to be helpful as we're navigating 2022. So let's get off on the right foot. It's a good time to assess how things went because we can really only make improvements once we know what some of those previous challenges were going to be. So there's a couple of different ways to evaluate that success. I know as safety people, we like to be numbers nerds. We can have all the spreadsheets and charts and dollar signs to tell us how great of a job we did. But really with this slide here, I wanted us to just have a gut check. We all kind of know already, did we do an A+ job or was it a fail? If we did want to look back and think of some of those more numbered centric, we do have some different methods that you can use. One is an easier one, the effectiveness evaluation. So for this, we'd want to look back at maybe the specific program as a whole, or maybe some more smaller specific projects. And did your objective actually come to fruition? Did we meet those objectives? Yes or no? If we have more yeses in that category, then sure, we were definitely more successful. The other way to look at it, and I know with other leaders within your facility, is the more financial-based analysis. So you could estimate the net cost of your program, the time it takes for you, any other resources that go into it, and we'd subtract the cost savings. That's a little bit harder to wrap your hands around, because some of those things that we're measuring, yes, it'll have a dollar assigned to it. Other those, we just have to have an estimate, especially when it comes to wages per hour and who all is involved in your program. So if we want to pivot from that, get away from just the numbers base, this is the next question that I want you to focus on. How would you score your safety program overall from the previous year? If you think it's an A+, then maybe you don't have all that many improvements to make. But I think most of us are going to score probably somewhere in the middle, maybe more C+ to B- range. And that's not a bad place to be, but it does mean that we can make some improvements. And now's the time to consider what those changes should be. If you are the safety leader for your company, maybe you think I did an A+ job, but I would also really encourage you to ask someone. And how you do that is up to you, kind of pinpointing someone, just walking down the hallway and catching them off guard. Maybe you'll get some honest feedback about how it went, but you also didn't get them to give them the time to consider your question. So maybe you'd want to set up a company survey, for instance. That's a thing that lots of people like to do. And how you want to score that and measure it is going to be up to you. But I think as part of anyone's safety program, as much as we're running it, we won't know how effective it is until we're asking someone else. So again, just honestly assessing what your previous process is going to be is going to give you some real good insights. Another way to do that is just through regulatory enforcement. So if you did have anyone visit on site, maybe it was OSHA, maybe it was an environmental regulator, how did it go? Was that process pretty painless, or was it a struggle to get through? One way or the other, it's either going to shine a light on some of the problems that existed, or we have something to celebrate with maybe how smoothly it had gone. And the other thing I wanted to point out on this is your safety program versus your safety culture. So your program, of course, is going to be the written rules that are established. And we're going to have written programs, and we have the rules on the poster boards everywhere. And all that is great and good and definitely needed when it comes to compliance, but that's not everything. The safety culture is, how does it feel? Do your employees feel cared for? Do they feel like they can listen? Are they trusting the program? Do they value it? Is it a part of their everyday life at work? So I know that we need to evaluate both of these. Are we actually building the foundational pieces like written programs that just go into the rulemaking, but also maybe the improvements can just be when it comes to the culture and how everyone's feeling, especially as we continue to roll with some of the changes with the pandemic. So as part of the assessment from last year, I already mentioned that most of us probably did a really great job, but what were the challenges that kept your program from doing better? This is always just a good place to start. And of course, the most popular answer I always hear is time. I just didn't have enough time to do it, or I thought I devoted enough time, and then we had a bunch of projects come out of nowhere, dealing with the pandemic, dealing with maybe some OSHA emergency temporary standards. Those are all things that are going to take away from what would have been some of your primary goals. So with that in mind, too many projects. And then again, that's going to go hand in hand with time as well. If we're only working, an inch deep and a mile wide, we can't really be too effective with any of those projects. How about not enough resources? I hear that one a lot as well. And the resources could just be different people's time. It could just be maybe some software that you need that would make your program a little bit more effective. And that's always going to come with money. If we had more money, we could do more things, right? And then the last one is apathy. So this is one in particular to where even as a safety leader, you may be doing all the right things. You do have enough budget that's allotted to you. Safety is prioritized, but if people aren't feeling it, then that apathy, as we've just experienced in the last couple of years, has been higher than ever. I get that people are over it. They're over being communicated to about safety. During the last couple of years of the pandemic, we've just had, resources and news flashes coming out from all directions. So they're getting it in their personal life. They're also getting it at work. We're just ready to be done with the whole thing. And I know that we can all have our own personal feelings about it, but we need to realize when those personal feelings don't apply when we're here at work. So if we are at work, we need to realize the difference between your personal apathy and what is actually going to be a work requirement to get through your daily activities. So I know that's one that we've been struggling with, especially in the last couple of years, and it is worth addressing because that could be the new focus and shift for your program later this year. As we're taking a look at your program, it's good to know kind of where you stand in the grand scheme of things. So I know, just speaking to all different industry types and all different safety leaders, if you've been at your facility for 5-10 years, you've probably got a pretty good program in place and you probably have some momentum working behind you. But not everyone's so lucky. Some of us are sort of entering this with zero experience, or it's only your first year or two. And there could be some of us that are just third-party consultants that are out there visiting all sorts of different types of facilities. So when we do that, oftentimes when we get there, some of these locations just don't even know where to start. Things are just happening around you. There's not even a reaction because we don't even know how to react. So if we're like looking at ground zero of a safety program, this is it. There basically is no safety program. If you're paying attention to this webinar, you're probably not in this boat, but you might be dealing with some people that are looking for some help to get there. So the next step that we're going to do is just start as small as we can by implementing a basic program. And it's good to know when you're looking at your safety program what it is and what it isn't, because as you're looking at this slide, and once we get towards the end, we know that some of that is a big jump to get there. What I want to emphasize are just some of the smaller changes that we can make, those incremental changes within your program that really can shift you from being a more reactionary program to more of a proactive program. So with the basic program, we're still going to be in the reactionary mode there. We've got some written programs. Maybe we're doing some training at least with the employees, but it's all just required training. And we know that we can pull resources. A good Google search will find you a lot of things. So with the basic program, we've cut and pasted. We've just downloaded a PDF. We have the bare minimum, but it may not necessarily apply to specific activities that you're working on. So that's the next step you want to be working towards. We do want to have a customized written program, things that are specific to the job activities that are happening on site. This type of program is going to be more robust. We're going to be doing PPE hazard assessments. We're going to be doing a job hazard analysis. We understand what the regulatory compliance issues are, and we can start to work toward those deadlines. Once we're here in the middle, we're starting to get employee buy-in as well. And this is probably a point to where you've at least established a safety committee meeting, you can do an accident review, and you're starting to build a little bit of momentum. Right here, I'd be calling this like our B+ range, or right in the middle. So this is where we at least want to get. Once we've at least gotten to that point, this is now when we can start to further those safety goals. You can now move and pivot into more of a proactive area. You can start to anticipate the problems and challenges that could affect your employees and just your industry in general. You can see a little bit further down the road, and that way, again, you can make the changes before they're actually happening and not just always reacting towards them. And just the golden rule or golden program that we want to get to is going to be towards the end here. This is, a type of facility that you're walking into where safety culture is expected. It's just a part of your everyday life there. You are not only hitting your safety goals, but you've met them and you're doing it consistently. And this is a place where safety is going to be prioritized. You're pretty much going to have total buy-in from both the employees, but also from the management because it's been prioritized so well. So once you know what those leading indicators are, you can hopefully just avoid them. I know we won't be able to avoid accidents altogether, but this is really where we're trying to move towards, and how we get there is just those smaller changes that happen from year to year. We know that none of this can just happen overnight. You can't go from the place of we don't know where to start to we're having consistent results in just 12 months. You're going to have improved results, but really once we get towards the end here, this is year to year results that we've had that have shown us what a successful program it's been. So to get to that kind of end of the program maturity scale there, it's going to take good planning. So again, those smaller changes that we can make is how we can shift in that direction. So I mentioned the written programs, but are those programs actually accurate, and are they published? Are they in a location to where people can easily find them, and do they even know how to find them? Regulatory deadlines, like I mentioned, we know that they're out there, but is it a part of your scheduled process? And we'll talk about getting those added to your Outlook calendar. A safety committee meeting and having follow-up is very, very important, but how often are you meeting? If you're at more of the basic program, maybe you can only scrap together enough time to meet once or twice a year. Well, if we're meeting more often, and if we have a little bit more buy-in and maybe some more members and different people that are a part of your meeting, obviously that can establish some more results for you. And as for employee training, this is probably the hardest one out of anything that's listed here. And that's because this can be an all-encompassing job that exists. So who and how will we manage this process? And both of those are important. Is it going to be just the one person who's in charge of everybody's training, or are there going to be multiple people involved in the process? If you have a smaller facility to where maybe it's 20 employees or less, this isn't as big of an ask. But if you've got 200 employees, 2,000 employees, that is a huge task. Training never ends. We'll address that later, but we're going to have our new hire training. We're also going to have ongoing training. So there's not just one point in the year to where we say, oh, we're done, everybody did it. This is going to take constant attention. So that's why we really need accountability for who is going to be in charge of that. As for accident investigations, we want to make sure that you do have a protocol in place. If you have especially a severe incident happening on site, you don't want to be training people as you're doing your investigation. Of course, we'd always like to include more people, but you should have a core team that already knows the established procedures. Especially if it's a severe injury, you're going to be working on a tighter time deadline, and we won't have all of the resources available when it is a severe injury like that. So following the injury, we also need to make sure that we're following up with our communication about that as well. And as for on-site audits, for most of us, we just know that it's going to be a best management practice to be walking your shop and walking your facility. So with that, your building could just be one building, or your property might have multiple buildings. It's good to establish a frequency and just knowing what that area is going to be to cover. If you have new buildings, for instance, then we know that that's going to be more time that needs to get added to your schedule. And the other important part about this is if you're walking some of these locations by yourself, then you only have to worry about saving your own time. But if you do plan to include department managers, if you do plan to include other people, we need to make sure that those are scheduled in advance and on people's calendars, and that way everyone can account for that time and know when and where to show up. So this is not going to be a Microsoft tech let's teach you how to use Outlook. And you might use Outlook, you might use something else. But there's definitely resources out there between our phones, Outlook, a shared Google Calendar, or some other software that you're using. I just want to make sure that we're saving time. We mentioned time was one of the biggest restrictions and challenges of last year. So it's good to just save time for yourself. And this is where some of that follow-up is going to be. I've learned that lesson personally. Now, when I'm having bigger meetings, if I'm following my safety meetings or any of my bigger client meetings, I'm actually putting 30 minutes or an hour later in the week that is blocked off within my schedule just so I can do follow-up. So I think that's just a good lesson to learn. Have your safety committee meeting, and then either the next week or later in the week, go ahead and save some time. That way you know that you have some attention for yourself to actually follow through on whatever those objectives were. And then with Google, we know, or in Outlook, we know that we can also set up a recurring schedule as well. So just, you probably know this already, but just want to encourage you to actually use this for some of your regulatory deadlines as well. If there are easy things that we need to do every week, or monthly tasks, or even those annual tasks, we need to know what we're working towards. And then with this, you can also set up some notification and reminders. That way, you know that that deadline is going to be approaching. So we can use this for bigger things like the regulatory deadlines that I mentioned, but we can also use them for the on-site audits, especially if you need to share meeting time and space with someone else. And then also with just little things like our emergency equipment. If you know that we need to go out and look at your extinguishers monthly, make sure you're setting that up either within your own calendar or sending that task to someone else so that it's saved in their calendar. Just an easy way to keep everyone on the same page. So again, just looking back on that maturity scale, for those of us that are sort of in the A- and A+ range, maybe we don't have to learn as many of these steps because you've already done them. But for those of us that were more at the beginning scale of this, I just wanted to establish some goals for us. And again, just so that we can take those steps to be maturing your program a little bit more. So the first one seems pretty obvious. Let's set some safety goals, but it's important to note what kind of safety goals. Saying that your program is going to just jump leaps and bounds is a great goal, but it might not be realistic. So a good thing to do is to focus on the safety behaviors and not necessarily just on the number. So I've mentioned looking back at some of your incidents from the previous year. Maybe you noticed that you had a bunch of lifting incidents, maybe more than you actually thought once you looked at them all together. So of course we can say no more lifting accidents that are going to happen in the future. But instead, if we're focusing on the safety behavior of just the good practices we can use as we're lifting things safely, that if we're doing that well is going to have an effect later about hopefully not having at least as many of those incidents. So part of doing that is just having some positive recognition. If you happen to be walking the facility, you're seeing someone lift in the way that you just trained everyone to do it, let's have some positive recognition. We're all humans. We all like that, pat on the back and the encouragement that we're actually doing what they trained us to do. And just some of those little daily encouragements is really, you don't think about it, but it's all those little things that are going to add up to people really buying into the safety culture. So speaking of that, we need to keep our employees involved in safety, and we want to make sure that we're including people from all levels and from all departments because everyone could be doing different activities on site. So it's important to get their input, especially if you've noticed with your historical trends that a number of incidents are coming from the same type of activity on site or the same department. Obviously, you're going to need to do a little bit more digging with what the challenges have been and why those accidents are happening. But if you get their involvement from the beginning of the year, maybe we're just including more people in our safety committee meetings, for instance, then you'll get that input ahead of time. And again, trying to be more proactive instead of reactive. And this is probably the most important lesson that you can learn no matter where you're at in that program maturity scale. You have to be able to respond to employee concerns and show the employees that you do care and that you are serious about follow-up. This is the biggest way to make a jump. And this is the biggest way to make a jump, especially when it comes to your safety culture. If they know that and I know some of our suggestions can be, I want a pizza party every Friday. I get it. That's not helpful to anyone. It's not serving them. But if people do have serious concerns about maybe the tools and equipment that they're using, you need to address it. And I know with some of these concerns, it could be that budget issue, it could be a resource issue. Maybe we can't just go out and buy all new tools. We still need to address the concern and what the steps we're taking about it. Maybe we can't do it now, but it's in the budget or in the plan for later this year. Just hearing that their concerns were heard, that they were considered, that you have found a solution for them is going to make all the difference in how they're responding to some of your communications in the future. So for this, I wanted to pivot over to the regulatory side of this. And again, this is just going to allow sort of a skeleton framework throughout the year of knowing what we need to be working towards. So since the beginning of the year, again, just another good time to assess your current requirements and deadlines that are out there. And the biggest thing is to assess if there's anything new. So are there any new environmental or safety regulations that are going to apply? And you can just look to see, has anything changed? So chemical storage is one of those things, either just in the changes in the types of chemicals or the volume that you have on site. If you've changed the volume, then that may affect tier 2, which we'll get to, and just notifying the amount of storage that happened. If you have above ground and underground storage tanks, is it still the same amount of tanks? And again, has the volume changed? We'll talk about your hazardous waste generator status, but I'd like you to think, for some facilities out there, there are ways that we can minimize the amount of waste pickups. And if you do that enough, you could possibly move down in a generator status. If that's possible, that's the goal, because it's going to make your job a little bit easier, because we'll have less regulations to deal with, and it's going to be a little bit more mindful towards the environment as well. We'll also want to look at your chemical inventory. Do we have any new chemicals on site? Sometimes they just get dropped off. We haven't followed up with actually getting that safety data sheet. We need to make sure that we have all these little things accounted for. Did your business change any processes on site that would actually require additional permitting? Sometimes we just, create a paint booth and we kind of forget that we needed an air permit to go along with it. I know with other bigger changes that you can't even do them without having the permitting in place. But for some of these paperwork issues, it's one of those things where like you'll get to it, you'll get to it, you'll get to it. But if you haven't done it, I'd really put that on your plate to get done for the beginning of this year. And then just, with everything that's happened the last couple of years, we've had a lot of buy-sells. So if you have any new owners or operators, if anything's changed with ownership, again, just one of those paperwork issues, you got to go back. Even if you have the permit in place, now you have to go back and update the permit. If you haven't done it already, again, this is good. These are things that you're going to need to be doing. But first, let's talk about the top 10 list with OSHA. So if you're taking a look at this list, if you've seen this from year to year, the number, or I should say, just the topics and the items that are on here, they have stayed the same from year to year. What changed from fiscal year 2020 to 2021 is just the order and the ranking of some of these items. So you may have noticed hazard communication is somewhere in the middle now. If we're looking at the top of the list, fall protection has been the #1 citation for the last 11 years. So no surprise. But in years past, it had always been fall protection #1, hazard communication #2. That's actually moved down to #5. With the pandemic happening, we've had definitely respiratory issues, wearing the right type of personal protective equipment. So we've seen an increase in citations in both respiratory programs and protection, and also with the PPE that employees should be wearing. So that's why you've seen both of those two items actually move up the list. So why does this apply to you? This is just a great way to get some insight on maybe where you need to focus your time. If you know that fall protection applies to your facility, but you're a little not up to date on that fall protection requirements, at least the general ones, you should be doing that because it is the #1 cited issue. So because we have that head over foot type of injury, that severe injury, that's always why it's noted as it's always why it is noted as the #1 citation. So this is just a good checklist to kind of go through. Do these apply to your facility? Do you feel good about the regulatory requirements for them? If you're feeling a little bit iffy, I'd encourage you to do some homework and dig a little bit deeper into those regulations to make sure that you do have a good process in place. And this is just a quick visual of what those citations are. These are the federal OSHA citations. So there was about 21,000 of them that got issued last year. And you can just see the ranking from top to bottom. Again, fall protection being towards the top. You can see the rise in HAZCOM and respiratory, and just, equally as you're looking down, you'll see where that number is going to get a little bit smaller. And I've mentioned some of these items, but we do have reoccurring deadlines, just like record keeping, Tier 2. It comes at the same time every single year, so we know that we need to comply with it. So these are all the different kinds of deadlines that you could be putting in your Outlook calendar or elsewhere. Your chemical storage for Tier 2, your chemical inventory, your fire evacuation map. If it's been a good year since you've looked at that, if you have had some changes on site, some fire extinguishers have moved around, this is just a good time to make sure that everything is still accurate and up to date. And then just based on some of the tools and equipment you're using on site, things like overhead cranes or lift inspections, those do require those types of equipment to be inspected once a year. As for quarterly deadlines, safety meetings, they don't have to happen quarterly. It just depends on your state. There are some safety meeting frequencies established, and others, it's more of a best management practice. But if you're meeting quarterly, that's a good amount to meet. It means that you're keeping up with things. You can change your content. You can make sure it's going to be more specific to whatever's happening at that time at your facility. And then I'm just mentioning the employee training as well. If you wanted to do that more often, I would encourage you to do that. But at the very least, I would keep your frequency at quarterly. We want to make sure that, again, once training's expired, they know that, and that way they can work towards getting that completed, and that they have time and opportunity to do that. Other monthly items or deadlines that are out there is going to be your emergency equipment. We got to look at those extinguishers and check those tags every month. Things like your spill prevention control and countermeasure plan inspections does require a monthly visual inspection of the tanks, the drums, and maybe any overhead pipes. Other weekly items to note could be that hazardous waste storage area. We would need, if you do have hazardous waste stored on site, we should be inspecting it once a week. And there's even some daily inspections that are out there as well. If we're using our forklift or our ladders, technically we should be looking to make sure that it is in good shape and satisfactory to use every single day. So those can be especially tedious and cumbersome to keep up with. So we want to really make sure that you have a good process and protocol and people are actually doing it day to day. I'll just poke at employee training a little bit more. Again, training doesn't start and stop. It's not all done at one specific point throughout during the year. It is going to occur throughout the year. So we know we need to train our new hires, and they kind of require the most amount of training because we need to train them on their job, the protocols, and safety. So there's a lot that goes into it. Other topics that are out there have their own deadlines. Emergency response and hazard communication. We want to make sure that we're doing that once a year. DOT training is every 3 years for shipping and handling hazardous materials. If personal protective equipment is changing on site, if people are getting respirators, obviously we need to address that. I'll just throw in COVID-19 training and communication. Some states are requiring actual training and content. So at the very least, you need to have some communication get established with what your protocols are going to be. And again, just knowing how to manage those expired training certificates. Is it one person who's going to manage that? Is it one person communicating to department managers? If we're going to have a little trickle down effect, we need to make sure that everyone's staying engaged and involved with that. And then the other process is just, do the employees know how to complete their training? If they're only doing it once a year, we want to make sure that they know how to do it, because it's never beneficial for, and it can be a time suck, if you're telling someone to do the training and then they immediately come back with, well, tell me how to do the training. And then you got to address that question with 100 employees on site. So again, with the stronger safety program, people are already familiar with how to log in, depending on how you're getting your training done. If it's all on site and together, that's an easy way to knock it out. But if you are using software, for instance, that people have to log into, people got to remember their unique usernames and passwords. So I know that can be a challenge in itself. So just managing not only the certificates, but the process and getting that information out is why I know that this can be a cumbersome responsibility, but nonetheless needs to have some accountability wherever it lies. So let's also take a look at the on-site incidents, and I am using the word incidents more strategically and not just accidents. So we want to make sure that this is a good way to look for improvement by looking at your injuries from the previous year. So once you get everything all together, if you only have 1 or 2 of them, yeah, maybe not too much of a pattern, you can congratulate yourself and say what a great job you did. But once you do get things all together and you're not just looking at things from week to week and quarter to quarter, it's just a good way to see if there were patterns and trends. Were the injuries and illnesses from the same department, or were they just scattered a little bit everywhere? How severe were the injuries? The other one is like, what kind of employee was injured? Did it have to do with age or just a job description pattern? So that's maybe something else that you need to focus and pivot towards. Maybe everyone that is doing the exact same activity on site is getting hurt a little bit differently, and you need to figure out why that's happening. So the trends and the type, of course, if you've had lots of lifting injuries or maybe lacerations, etc., we can dig into that. The other one to kind of look at is just the time of day. Is it early in the morning? Maybe it's dark and we had a lot of slips on ice. Maybe it's towards the end of the day and we just need better lighting. Maybe we do have more injuries at the end of the day because people are rushing through it. Maybe a lot of things are happening between 4 o'clock and 5 o'clock. That's worth noting. And why is it important? We can go through the 5 whys and get down to the root cause. The other thing to look at is just your experience modifier. This is the number that we use when it comes to your workers' compensation policy and how much you're paying. Some policies are year to year, some are multi-year. If that number is going to be changing, did your experience modifier improve? If it did, congratulations, you've been saving your facility a little bit more money on their bottom line. So there are just different ways to look at it. You can look at it from just the cost of injuries that happened. Of course, if you've had an injury to where it's requiring time away from work, it's going to have a surgery that's associated with it. And they have to have physical therapy and all sorts of things. The types of injuries that really linger are obviously going to be a bit more costly. So we want to avoid those more costly injuries that are out there, but we should also give some attention to just the frequency and severity of maybe the smaller injuries that are costing you a little bit of money, but even if we could keep those from happening, that's also going to save you some money on the bottom line as well. And all of this is just good content, especially with it being the beginning of the year for your safety meetings. If you haven't looked at this collectively together, this is, sometimes you don't think everyone's interested in all of the safety facts that are out there or data points that you have, but this is the kind of stuff that I think people can get into and find neat and really not think about just the injuries, but some solutions that could be creative and unique that you wouldn't have thought of on your own if you hadn't asked the people more specific to perhaps that department where it came from. So I mentioned before that I was trying to be purposeful when I was using the word incidents and not just accidents, because I think as you're talking or thinking about your program maturity, this is where a difference can be made. There's going to be incidents to where something happened, and then there's also going to be some near misses. And if we start moving from the point to where we're not just talking about an incident, which is going to be both an accident or some other things that happen on site, but also taking into consideration the near misses, this is where we can start to pivot from being reactive to proactive. So if you're wondering what the difference, I know it seems a little self-explanatory, but an incident is something that's already happened. And this could be an injury, it could be, property damage, it could be a spill, but something bad has already happened. A near miss is going to be something that almost happened. I almost cut my hand really bad, but maybe I moved at the last minute, or my PPE saved me, etc. So tracking those near misses are going to be things that you can do to hopefully give you some vision into the future. And that way, if one person did it right, maybe you can communicate so others can do it too. If we're going to start tracking just incidents that are happening on site, of course, we're used to talking about accidents, which is going to be the injuries and illnesses. These types of incidents could affect an employee, or it could be a non-employee. Maybe you had a customer who was injured on site. That's worth discussing, of course, because we would obviously want to prevent that in the future. What if we have auto accidents? This could be a company-owned vehicle or not. If someone else's property was damaged, or someone else's vehicle was injured on site, we would want to know about that. And then property damage too. It could be your building, it could be tools, equipment, but if things are costing you money, you're obviously going to want to know why that happened. And if we've had any spills on site as well, where did it happen? Why did it happen? And it's good just to have that little catch-all category of other. So again, this is just going to provide some of these evaluations a bit more insight into maybe where you can focus your program going forward. Always good to look historically at accidents, of course, looking at accidents as they're happening throughout the year, but knowing where some of those near misses were can help you avoid those in the future. And then I know we're coming towards the end of our topic here, but just wanted to mention those safety committee meetings. I know no one loves doing meeting after meeting, so I just want to make sure that the time that you're asking for people is efficient and effective. So come prepared to these meetings. If you guys have a pretty set agenda, I think that that's a great idea. I think it's a good idea to, mix it up every now and then too, but there's got to be some items that you are talking about regularly. Things like the accident reviews that I mentioned. So if that's the case, I would distribute your agenda ahead of time. That way everyone can come prepared. If you're going to talk about accidents, you need to know what those accidents are, for instance. And that way, no one just wants to sit in the meeting while people are calling other people to bring the paperwork that you're then just going to review all together. It's better if you already know what the accidents have been. You've taken some time to kind of absorb what that is, and that way you can actually do some analyzing together and you're not just reading through the details. That can get pretty dull pretty quickly. And for some of our more severe injuries, of course, we're going to have to do that together as a team. But if you've had a lot of injuries, you don't need to just sit there for 25 minutes reading through the date and the time. That's just hard for people to do. So let's mix it up if we can. Because you're meeting hopefully pretty regularly, there's always going to be some seasonal topics, whether that has to do with the regulations that are around you, or maybe just, the time of year. We know that it's the winter season right now. You can talk about that, and you wouldn't talk about that once it is summertime. The other thing to think about is just rotating your membership to these meetings. If it's the same 5 to 10 people that have done it every single year, then yeah, your meeting can get a little stale at that point. It's good to, and it's also good for your safety culture to continue to have that employee buy-in. I think it's good to include both new employees and seasoned employees, because again, they might have some insight from other workplaces that they've come from that maybe you just hadn't considered yet. They'll just have kind of more of a third-party view before they're just sort of too used to things. So I'd consider every year swapping out who's going to be a part of these meetings and not. And then if you're really just looking for some inspiration, you can always look outward. Look at the other industries. I know we can get a little stuck in what we're working in because, of course, we want everything to be pertinent to what we're dealing with. But maybe oil and gas is using some cool software, or maybe you've learned that the way that they've focused some of their meetings are different. So some of the safety conferences, things like this, these are just great ways to get some new ideas and inspiration that you could possibly be implementing on site. And then the last thing is just looking for state resources or just free resources. I'll use Arizona again as just an example. They do have a state OSHA, plan state. But with that, they also have some free consulting services, and most states do. Most states are going to have a small business hotline. There's people that are going to be there to help. Of course, we know regulators come on site, and most of our interactions with them are, pretty can be stale, and we feel like we're always getting into trouble. But most of the departments out there actually want to be helpful. So I'd encourage you to look around to see if there are free webinars, if there are some free advice that you could be getting from some of the resources that may be closer to you than you think. And then just with everything kind of going digitally because of the pandemic the last couple of years, people have made a lot of this content available and free. So sometimes I know we had to be in person, and that really might not be the case as much in the future. So I just encourage you to look around for that. So I just wanted to summarize pretty quickly about what I think are going to be some good steps for changing your program this year. And that is really taking an honest assessment, a good hard look at what you did last year, what the challenges were, knowing what those challenges are. Maybe you can work through them a little bit differently this year. We also need to know the regulations because, like I said, that's going to just apply or give you a skeleton outline of what you need to be working towards throughout the year. If there are improvements, what can we do? How can we be providing a little bit more sparkle to this program, getting people feeling a little bit more engaged, and then putting them into practice? So give it a try something different. And again, I just wanted to emphasize the follow-up. So maybe it's the smaller incremental changes you can make. If that's going to be more realistic for you and your facility, that's still a step in the right direction. So I just encourage everyone to be moving that way.
Well, thank you, Amanda, and thank you all for joining us today. Again, we appreciate any questions that you've sent. See that there's a few in the queue now, and remind you that those will indeed be forwarded on to our speaker. And we're winding down. You might have just a bit more time to do so, but if you'd like to, that's in the Q&A tab there at the bottom of the screen. Before we do conclude, as we mentioned at the beginning today, just want to let everyone know about the evaluation survey we're asking you to complete. The survey will open in a different screen after this webinar, and we truly appreciate your input as it will help us improve our future webcasts. With that, we end today's Safety and Health Magazine webcast. We'd like to thank Amanda Rawls, everyone at KPA, and all of you who listened in. Thanks and have a great day.